It started with a letter in an envelope that looked like junk mail. No fancy law firm logo. No dramatic certified mail stamp. Just a plain, beige rectangle that had been shoved through the mail slot at the protagonist's small apartment in Portland, Oregon. He almost threw it out, assuming it was a credit card offer or an insurance promo. But something about the return address, Bakersfield, California, made him pause. He only had one remaining relative there, a great-uncle he hadn't spoken to in nearly a decade. When he opened it, there was a single page from a law office confirming that the relative had passed, and had left behind a parcel of land, 0.61 acres, unincorporated, on the edge of a gated suburban neighborhood. At first, he assumed it was a mistake. He didn't know of any land in his name. But after a few quick calls, and one notarized form, it was confirmed. The land was his, now free and clear. He didn't expect much from it. Maybe he could sell it off, or let it sit until it appreciated. But something pulled him south, a curiosity maybe. Or just a sense of obligation. He took a week off work and drove down to see the plot in person. What he found wasn't what he expected. The lot wasn't empty. It wasn't even available. It was occupied full. Not by a building, but by dozens of vehicles. Cars, SUVs, even a small boat on a trailer. Parked tightly, bumper to bumper, like a commuter lot. People had painted over curbs, marked fake stall lines, installed parking bumpers. Someone had even erected a sign that said, Red Oak Reserve, guest parking only. It looked official. It wasn't. He stood there for a long time, just staring. The land wasn't paved. It was hard-packed dirt, dry and cracked at the edges, surrounded by hedges that looked like they'd been trimmed. There was even a trash can labeled HOA waste only. That was the first time he heard the name Karen. She marched toward him from across the cul-de-sac like she owned gravity. Short blonde bob, oversized sunglasses, clipboard in hand. She didn't ask who he was. She told him, You can't be here unless you're authorized. This is HOA property. He said nothing for a beat. Then, quietly, Actually, it's mine. She stared, confused, then angry. She asked who he was. He explained about the inheritance, the property line, the paperwork. She laughed, an airy, contemptuous sound, and said, That's not possible. This has been community parking for over 10 years. When he pulled out the printout from the county assessor, she barely glanced at it before waving her hand. We've had verbal agreements with the city. You'll need to take this up with the HOA. But I'll warn you now, it won't go anywhere. She turned and walked away. He stood there for a long time after she left, watching the sun dip over a field full of other people's cars. The next day, he returned with laminated signs. Private property. No parking. Violators will be towed. He drove stakes into the corners and posted the signs clearly. It took less than 24 hours for them to be vandalized. Spray paint. Stickers. One was pulled down entirely and thrown in a nearby drainage ditch. He called the city. They acknowledged that the land was indeed private, but said any towing would have to be initiated and paid for by the owner. The police wouldn't intervene unless there was an act of vandalism caught on camera. And no, the city had no records of any easement or agreement for community parking. Still, the cars stayed. The third day, he confronted a man in a golf cart who seemed to be patrolling the area. The man claimed to be on the HOA board and warned him not to escalate things. They were working with their legal counsel, he said, and there were community interests at stake. Karen showed up again later that afternoon. This time she had a small audience, neighbors who gathered on sidewalks, arms crossed, expressions tight. She accused him of gentrification, of trying to flip inherited land for profit, of threatening single mothers and senior citizens who depended on the lot for parking. He tried to explain that he wasn't looking to flip anything, that he just wanted to secure his property and figure out what to do with it. But no one listened. She followed him back to his car, filming him with her phone. Later that evening, his name and face were posted to the community next door page. A long rant from Karen claimed he was a greedy outsider, trying to sue the HOA for a land grab. The post exploded. He received angry messages from people he didn't know. One person threatened to make it hard for him to come back. A week later, he returned with a drone of his own, used it to film the lot from above, gathering footage of every license plate, every illegally parked vehicle. He posted a video to YouTube. They're stealing my land, here's the proof. Within 48 hours, it had over 30,000 views. The comments were split. Some supported him. Others accused him of being a troll. Then came the anonymous envelope. No return address. Inside, a flash drive and a one-sentence note. If you want to win, start here. The flash drive contained PDFs, scanned documents from internal HOA emails, including a forged easement request allegedly submitted by a neighboring landowner. There were notes about converting the lot officially through city bureaucracy, but the request had never been filed. Worse, there was a Photoshop file, layers and all, of the fake documents. He brought it all to Robert Caldwell, a real estate attorney with a reputation for suing HOAs. Robert reviewed the evidence and whistled. This isn't a parking dispute. This is coordinated fraud. That was the moment the tone changed. Robert drafted cease and desist letters, had them delivered to every known board member, and filed preliminary complaints with both the city and the county. He also notified the police that any future vandalism on the property would be considered part of a broader civil conspiracy. Next, they built the fence, not a polite, white picket affair. This was industrial-grade steel, bolted into concrete, 12 feet high, capped with motion-activated cameras and floodlights. One way in, one way out. The gate was electronic. Entry required payment. He installed a kiosk, private parking, $25 per day. Monthly permits available upon request. A QR code linked to a billing site. It was all legal, registered with the county, and taxable. Karen lost her mind. She called the police. They arrived, reviewed the paperwork, and shrugged. It was private land. If people didn't want to pay, they could park somewhere else. Karen organized protests. Neighbors held up signs. Some refused to leave their cars and racked up hundreds of dollars in unpaid fees. 2 weeks later, the first round of invoices went out. Not small ones. Over $19,000 in unpaid parking across 46 vehicles. When they refused to pay, Robert filed lawsuits. Each one documented. Each one backed with surveillance logs, timestamps, footage, and certified notices. They didn't stand a chance. Then came the class action countersuit, filed on behalf of the protagonist, alleging harassment, defamation, trespass, and conspiracy to commit fraud. The evidence was airtight. Karen took the stand last. The Photoshop file was shown to the court. So were her messages bragging about winning the lot back without spending a dime. Her smirking arrogance melted when the judge asked her, "Do you consider forging legal documents to be within your role as HOA president?" The jury took less than a day. The damages were substantial. Karen was removed from the HOA. Several board members resigned. Some residents settled their parking debts quietly, others paid with gritted teeth. Karen was fined, and the city launched an investigation into HOA misappropriation. The lot, once a forgotten patch of dirt, was transformed. It became a regulated parking facility. Stripe painted, patrolled, secure. It made enough monthly income to pay the protagonist's mortgage, and then some. He added a weekend market, food trucks, local vendors, live music. Slowly, the same neighbors who once hated him began stopping by. A new HOA board was elected. Less hostile, more cooperative. They asked if he'd be open to collaboration, perhaps discounted parking for seniors, community discount days. He agreed, under written contracts. He didn't seek revenge, just respect, and he got it. Once the court rulings were final and the parking lot became operational, the protagonist thought the worst had passed. He expected the bitterness to fade slowly over time, for grudges to harden and calcify into silent stares across the street, or quick glances through closed blinds. He didn't expect the shift to come so quickly. It wasn't forgiveness, exactly. But it was adjustment. Reluctant respect. People who had once hissed his name in neighborhood group chats now nodded at him when they passed through the gate to pay their daily parking fee. Some of them, almost sheepishly, complimented the upgrades, striped lines, solar-powered lights, designated handicap spaces. One man who'd been especially loud online even approached him after the Saturday farmer's market and handed him a six-pack of craft beer with a stiff handshake. "I said a lot of things," the man muttered. "Karen made it sound like you were out to destroy the neighborhood." The protagonist didn't respond right away. Then he said, "She was out to pretend it was hers." The man just nodded and walked away. The truth was, Karen had changed the way the neighborhood understood authority. Her downfall had exposed something bigger than herself. The whole idea of community, ownership, had always been tenuous, legal fiction built on convenience and illusion. But when one woman with just enough charisma, enough control of the group emails and the bylaws, weaponized that illusion, it became a power structure. A small empire run on entitlement and groupthink, and nobody questioned it until it fell apart. The protagonist had learned a great deal through the process, more than he'd ever wanted to know about easements, land disputes, HOA power structures, and the fragile egos that filled them. But the biggest lesson came not in court, or through the lawsuits, but in the way people reacted once the land was clearly and legally his. They adapted. People complained, yes, but they paid. They followed the new signs. They booked space for pop-up stalls at the weekend market. They brought their kids to the artisan fairs. And gradually, a curious thing happened. The land became useful. Not just in a practical, monetized way, but in a social one. It stopped being a battleground and became a hub. The protagonist began to see something strange. The very people who had once treated the lot like an extension of their garages were now asking how they could contribute. A small co-op of local growers asked if he'd consider hosting a monthly swap meet. A nearby church asked if it could reserve space for their Sunday shuttle bus. He said yes, but he charged them like anyone else. Fairly, contractually, bound by paperwork. He had learned what happened when you let people use your property based on good faith. You ended up in court. Some resented that. But not for long. The real shift came with the school fundraiser. One of the new HOA board members, a younger man with a background in logistics, proposed using the lot as the main location for the neighborhood spring carnival. It was something Karen had always vetoed in the past, claiming that open gatherings invited vagrants. But now, with the new board and the old queen dethroned, the idea got traction. The protagonist agreed, on one condition: all money raised had to go directly to the school's STEM program. He waived the fee for one weekend, donated tents and security lighting, and even paid for the permits himself. The event was a success. Over 1,000 people came through in 2 days. Kids screamed through obstacle courses and laughed over cotton candy. Retired neighbors danced to live music. Someone even printed a t-shirt that said, "I park here, and all I got was a sense of private property rights." The protagonist kept that one dot, but despite the new piece, he never took down the fence. The cameras stayed up. The lights stayed sharp. The kiosk was maintained and updated. Because peace, he had learned, was not the absence of threat. It was the presence of structure. He invested in upgrades. Hired a local woman to manage the lot's digital booking system. Installed license plate readers that automatically logged entry and exit times. Switched to solar for the lighting. Added a second gate for larger events. Revenue tripled. He turned the profit into microgrants, small, quiet acts of investment. One to the local food pantry. One to a single mother who needed car repairs. One to a teen mechanic trying to start his own tire service out of a pop-up booth. He didn't advertise these. He just signed the checks, but people noticed. And more importantly, they respected it. What no one could see, however, was how close it had come to being the opposite. If he hadn't found the Photoshop file. If the anonymous tip hadn't come. If Robert Caldwell hadn't known the right civil codes and zoning loopholes. If Karen had been just a little smarter, a little less greedy, she might have pulled it off. She might have wrestled the land from him using nothing more than paperwork and popular pressure. It haunted him. Sometimes, how fragile the line was between theft and legality. He started keeping a folder of similar cases from across the country. Most of them were never resolved. Some never even went to court. A lot of people, he realized, didn't have the time or money or will to fight. They gave up. Sold out. Let the Karens of their world take what didn't belong to them. Just a piece. That wasn't peace. That was surrender. He wrote an article for a small online publication called Civic Sentinels, titled What I Learned from Reclaiming My Inherited Lot. It was half memoir, half warning. It didn't go viral, but it circulated in niche forums, law students, libertarians, small-scale property owners, HOA watchdogs. Within a month, his inbox filled again, not with threats this time, but with questions. Can I sue my HOA for false easement? Is a sign legally enforceable if it's vandalized? Can I charge for parking on a gravel lot if it's zoned agricultural? He replied to each one personally. Never offered legal advice, just shared his story and recommended resources. Slowly, he realized that what he'd been through wasn't just a local land dispute. It was a blueprint. He was contacted by a small civil liberties nonprofit based in Texas. They asked if he'd speak at their annual summit. Not as a victim, but as an example. He hesitated. He didn't like public speaking. But they offered to cover everything. So he agreed. The room was modest, maybe 200 people. But the reception was overwhelming. His speech was short, direct, quiet. He didn't rage. He didn't moralize. He just laid out the facts. How quickly a neighborhood can turn on you. How the law can lag behind ethics. How bureaucracy can be used as a weapon. How the truth is only as useful as your ability to prove it. The last thing he said was this. Property doesn't protect itself. And kindness won't stop people from trying to take what isn't theirs. But the law will, if you have the stomach to use it. They gave him a standing ovation. When he got back to town, the lot was exactly how he left it. Cars parked. Fees collected. Market on Saturday. School buses on Sunday. He made himself a coffee and sat at the edge of the fence, just watching the rhythm of a space once stolen, now reclaimed. He still didn't know who sent that anonymous tip. He never found out. But sometimes, when he saw the lights from the new gate flicker on at dusk, and the cameras held gently to track an entering car, he'd whisper a quiet thank you to the silence. Then he'd lock the gate and head home. By the time the 5th year passed since reclaiming his land, the protagonist had come to understand something that no courtroom, no council hearing, and no neighbor had ever taught him. Legacy wasn't about monuments. It was about memory. The kind people carried, quietly and unshakably, when they stood on firm ground and knew why it was firm in the first place. The lot was still his. Still bordered by the steel gate. Still tracked by the same cameras, newer models now, AI integrated, infrared, cloud synced. He didn't update them out of fear. He updated them out of principle. He had built the place not just to defend his rights, but to prove they were real, defensible, tangible. His, even when no one challenged it anymore, he kept defending it. There was a dignity in that. Each year, the micro market expanded. It now ran Friday to Sunday. Local farmers brought fresh eggs, cut flowers, honey. Artists displayed handmade jewelry, reclaimed wood furniture, screen-printed t-shirts. What had once been considered spike infrastructure, a fence built out of defiance, had become a revenue stream, a civic center, and a case study all at once. University students visited to research land use conflicts. HOA reform groups cited his case in presentations. A law professor in Massachusetts taught an entire seminar titled Entitlement versus Ownership, the Whitaker Doctrine, even though the protagonist never used the name. He just called it doing what's right. With proof. The national attention never fully disappeared, but it softened. Evolved. People no longer saw him as a combatant. They saw him as a template. His story had moved the legislative needle. 7 states passed bills strengthening landowner notification rights and restricting HOA control beyond their legal jurisdiction. California updated its civil trespass statutes to explicitly include unmapped use of privately owned land by organized community groups. The term, constructive easement abuse, became a recognized legal concept. All of it had started with an envelope and a dirt lot, and one man who said no. But what no one talked about, what never made it into the law reviews or HOA newsletters, was how much of himself he gave to win. The first 2 years were spent in a state of tension most men don't survive. Not because of guns or violence or public rage, but because of something slower, more corrosive, disbelief. Disbelief that his word, backed by a deed and a name and a title, meant so little until it was fought for, expensively, exhaustively, and legally. He'd wake in the middle of the night sometimes with the old feelings crawling back, the hollow space between being right and being believed. The eerie realization that until the court ruled, his certainty didn't matter. He wrote journals about it, not for publication. For processing. He filled 5 hardcover notebooks over those years. Not memoirs. Not therapy. Just raw truth. He wrote about the first time he saw Karen scrawl across his signage in red spray paint. The first time he was called a parasite on a neighborhood Facebook group. The first night he stood in the dark, watching someone dig tire tracks into his land, knowing he couldn't stop them. Yet he documented his transformation. From passive heir to active landowner. From victim to litigant. From the quiet man in the back row to the one who drew a line, held it, and invited the world to see what it meant to stand still under pressure. In his 6th year on the land, the county supervisor visited. It wasn't a formal meeting. No cameras. No press. Just a walk through the lot. The supervisor, an earnest woman in her 40s, asked if she could better understand the community dynamic you helped define. He offered her coffee from the market booth. They walked the rows. He explained the changes. The revenue model. The fee waivers for nonprofit use. The transparency policy he adopted voluntarily, posting his rate sheet and maintenance expenses for anyone to review. You did all this without being required to, she noted. I had to prove I wasn't the problem, he replied. And then keep proving it. She took that in. Didn't argue. Would you ever sell? She asked. He shook his head. Selling is what they hoped I'd do. What about expansion? He paused, thought about it, then said, I don't build until someone tries to take what I already have. The conversation ended with mutual respect. Nothing changed on paper, but something shifted in spirit. The county, once wary of him, now saw him as a standard bearer, not an adversary. A barometer for ethical land use. That winter, the mayor's office nominated the lot for a Community Resilience Award. He declined, but he attended the ceremony anyway. He watched from the back as they read off the citation. For turning conflict into community, resistance into reform, and dirt into a foundation. He didn't go on stage. He clapped politely. Then he left early. That night, he wrote only one line in his notebook. I didn't do this to be celebrated. I did it so the next person won't have to. By the 7th year, the land had not only paid for itself, it had quietly become one of the most profitable small parcels in the county. The irony wasn't lost on him. What began as an unwanted inheritance, a headache wrapped in sand and weeds, had grown into a fully self-sustaining enterprise. He never intended to profit from conflict. But he wasn't ashamed of it either. He had done everything by the book. Posted his signage. Filed his permits. Documented everything. And when people challenged him, he responded not with shouting but with paperwork. With dates, maps, and names. That, more than anything, had shocked his opponents. Not that he resisted, but that he did so intelligently. That kind of resistance doesn't make you many friends in politics. So, when the mayor's staff quietly suggested he run for a local commission seat, he laughed. I'm not a politician, he said. No, one aide replied. But you're what people think politicians should be. He didn't run, but the suggestion stayed with him. Later that year, he was invited to testify in front of a state legislative committee considering new protections for landowners facing HOA harassment. It was supposed to be a 10-minute slot, procedural, lightly attended. It wasn't. Word got out. Civic groups packed the room. One of the sponsors read his name aloud, just his first name, no title, and half the room stood to applaud. He didn't expect it. He didn't want it. But he accepted it. In his remarks, he spoke calmly. I'm not here to tell you what to believe. I'm just here to tell you what happened. I inherited land that was mine on paper, but claimed by people who thought usage was ownership. When I tried to assert my rights peacefully, I was threatened, defamed, harassed. And when I defended myself legally, I was called aggressive. I wasn't aggressive. I was accurate. The committee passed the bill out of session with a 12-to-1 vote. That moment solidified something. Not status. Not fame. Credibility. He had become a voice in a conversation he never meant to enter, and couldn't exit now. Even if he wanted to. He began receiving formal requests from county boards and law associations, asking for comments on zoning reform proposals and easement regulations. Robert Caldwell, now his longtime attorney and close friend, joked, "You're a private land baron with public expectations." The work became heavier. Not physically, but mentally. He spent more time answering emails than walking the lot. More time in meetings than at the vendor stalls. And when he visited the fence line, it was less to check for damage and more to remember why he built it. Then came the backlash. Not from his town. Not from Karen. She had long since vanished into legal obscurity, having moved and changed her name. The new opposition came from commercial developers and pro-growth councils who argued that anti-easement rhetoric was stifling urban expansion. They didn't name him directly, but everyone knew. He was asked on a national radio show to defend his anti-communal stance. He refused the invitation. He wrote a short response instead, published in a journal. It read, "My stance isn't anti-communal. It's pro-consent. Shared use must be voluntary. Not coerced. Not assumed. Not inherited from an illegal custom. A neighborhood is not a kingdom, and a deed is not a suggestion." That quiet essay was read in law schools across the country. A constitutional attorney in D.C. contacted him months later and said, "You may have created the next layer of private property jurisprudence." He shrugged. "All I did was build a gate." Privately, he felt tired. Worn in ways that the public never saw. Every legal win cost time. Every policy conversation chipped away at his quiet. Every appearance made him less of a man and more of a metaphor. He didn't want to be a metaphor. He wanted to be a person with a fence. A notebook. A property no one stole. So, in the 8th year, he began pulling back. He still maintained the lot. Still showed up to local events. Still donated a portion of profits to legal defense funds for landowners